our podcast, Raising Bigs. This podcast is an ongoing conversation between myself and my young adult son. We're ready and willing to talk about all the things families might experience in their lives and relationships, both as parents and young adults, from teens to 20-somethings, the good, the bad, and sometimes the ugly. As the parent in this duo, I've been very intentional about creating happy memories with my kids throughout their lives, both individually and as a group. It's so interesting now that they are bigs to hear what they remember. What were the memories made that hold meaning for them today? The ones that really stuck, the ones that bring back laughter and joy. It's often not what you think. Yes, the big trips and fancy events are fun to remember, but sometimes the true gems are found in the simple little things, rituals that make up the framework of our younger lives, one-off spontaneous moments that brought unexpected sparks of fresh energy or newly discovered favorites, things you always did that now feel like home, memory makers you didn't even know mattered in the moment. Let's dive in. I'm Marci and I'm the mom.
I'm Cade and I'm her kid. We just had family dinner last night before recording this episode with my sister and her boyfriend. This is something that we started a few years back when we were all adults and our schedules started to become more busy than they were when we were kids. It might have started off as a way for my mom just to see us all together and watch us interact, which is one of her favorite things, and she'll always find an excuse for that. But now it's a tradition at these dinners that we not only catch up each other on what's going on in our lives, but inevitably we revisit the core memories that we all hold in our hearts from growing up together. So, Mom, I'm curious about when you were creating all of these family memories for us to have as we got older. When did it become important to you, and why did you put in such an effort to keep doing it all those years and creating those memories for us?
So funny enough, I had learned about intentional living and being an intentional person before I ever had kids. That was one of the first things I learned along my personal growth journey. And so I was pretty good as a young adult in trying to create memories for myself. And so creating memories surrounding having children started before you guys were even born. Like before your big brother was born, I went to Build-A-Bear and I made a bear. And I did this with all three of you. And it was the Christmas before you were born. So each one of you has a bear that was made before you were even born. Now, you guys are all big. None of you wanted to have to cart your bears around for the rest of your life. So I actually have them in a bucket downstairs. And someday, if and when I have grandchildren, like all three of those bears will be there, along with your travel pillows made by your grandma and your travel blankets. And so I'm imagining a little kid being able to choose whose bear they want to play with and whose pillow they want to take a nap on. And that's intentional on my part, right? Now, did I know when I made those bears that that was going to be the end game for me? No, I didn't. But that started before you guys were even born. And it was important for me, not only for you guys to have those memories, but for me to have those memories. I did a lot of scrapbooking when you guys were little, and I still have scrapbooks to finish for you. But I do know that even now, when you guys pull those out, it brings you joy. A couple of weeks ago, Tim and I were gone, and you guys pulled out the DVDs of our family movies and watched those. And so while in the moment, I might have been preserving those memories just for the sake of preserving them. I take a ton of pictures. I still do this today, but you never know what those things are going to mean down the road. And so if you don't do them, right? If you don't be intentional about creating memories, you're never going to have them to look back on. So that for me was why it was important and why I continue to make an effort to do that. We were just talking last night at dinner about something in my family, the concept of a bed snack. And when I grew up, we had a whole conversation about this. When I grew up, my grandpa I always had a bed snack with him. And if you ask any of my cousins, they also, when they were at grandma and grandpa's, had a bed snack. And when my grandpa died, we actually talked about bed snacks at the funeral. And so as little kids, even at home, we always had a bed snack. Sometimes it was graham crackers and milk. Sometimes it was a banana sliced up with milk. Sometimes it was ice cream. Sometimes it was cookies, whatever that might be. That is not something I continued with my kids, just because as we learned more about healthy eating and things like that, I tried to not create that habit with them. But we occasionally did have a bed snack. But that's a memory I have from when I was a little kid. And that is a core memory for me and something that makes me very happy. So I knew the value, that's just one example, but knew the value of what that would be. And so I intend when I have grandkids, and you might laugh at this, but they will always have a bed snack at Grammy's house. That's just going to happen. So that's why I've made such an effort and will continue to make an effort probably until I am a very crotchety old lady that can't create new memories because I'm just sitting in the chair enjoying looking at you guys and how you are, right? Like that, that's what will keep me excited and happy to keep going, is being able to create those new memories, even with you as a 60-year-old, right?
Mhm.
I think that's
Yeah. For sure. And I think coming from a family that has, such strong memories and did things like that, I'm sure that probably, kind of played a part into making that important for you. And, you having those things that you did with your grandparents or with your parents or whatever it is, and, wanting to recreate that for your kids. So I definitely think that's important.
Yeah, and carrying something forward, some things forward, but also then creating things that are very unique to our family unit, some of which you guys will choose to carry on maybe, and then others that you won't. So,
Mm.
Kate, can you tell me what it means to you? So the other side of that, to have that shared memory bank of special times, specifically with your siblings, address that first for me.
Yeah, for sure. I think it is, kind of just something that brings us closer together and helps us bond. And I think especially I think about, once we're older, eventually, you're no longer going to be here with us and things like that. So I think having those memories and even, memories with our grandparents and stuff like that, once they're no longer here with us, or our cousins or things like that, just anyone in our lives, having those memories and having that kind of bank of memories is very important. And I think especially with your siblings, having someone there that was also there with you to experience it. And it's not just, oh, I remember this one memory by myself. And I think having someone to share those memories with is very important, rather than it just being something that only you experienced. Yes, you can tell people about it and you can kind of share the stories, but I think having someone else who lived it with you is definitely very important. And sometimes too, you guys have different perspectives of the memories. Even as kids, we all went to one of my great aunt's cabin all the time with all of our cousins. But it's funny, when all those cousins get together and we'll talk about things like that. And, maybe some of the older cousins have a memory that the younger cousins didn't, or maybe the girl cousins went and did something that the boy cousins didn't do, or, whatever it may be. Just sharing those memories and having things to talk about, with your siblings, with your cousins, with your parents, whatever it may be. Building those memories is definitely very important, especially when you look at, when people of our family are no longer here with us. Having those memories to reflect on and remember the good times can definitely be very, very important.
Yeah, and I love that for you guys, and I love hearing you talk about, the shared memories you have. And it's funny because sometimes your memory of how things happen is totally different than the way I remember it, because I was viewing it at the time, right? I maybe wasn't even totally present in the moment in the way in which I would have liked to be, because I was the one executing, right?
Uh-huh.
In order to make the memory happen. And so it's fun for me to get to relive it from your guys' perspective when you're chatting about it, because I'm like, okay, yep, that was why I did it. And it just hits in a special way when you realize that maybe you didn't experience it the same way they did, but that it really hit the way you intended it.
For sure. And I know sometimes we even talk about too about memories that you didn't even intend to make or things like that that end up almost kind of being our favorites. I know, there's several things with us cousins too and things like that. It'll be little things that happened, at family events or family Christmases or things like that. And in the moment, you didn't think anything of it, just oh, okay, whatever. But, years later, those little things can definitely be big memories.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's for sure.
For sure. But mom, you not only made sure that we had joint meaningful experiences with us siblings, and making sure that we had, shared experiences, but you also made sure that we all had individual ones as well. And, time just with you and memories just with you. Was that something you did consciously? Why did you think it was important? What was kind of your goal with that?
Yeah, so I really wanted to make sure, and I don't even remember where I heard this piece of advice, but I know that I did at one point in time as a very young parent. And it was probably about the time your sister, second born, right? About the time she came along, that you needed to really make sure that you were spending one-on-one time with each child. And so that started out very simply when you guys were little. Like, I would take one of you and go to the store, right? To go run errands on a Saturday morning or whatever, so that we had some one-on-one time. And then that kind of morphed as you guys got older, and you weren't a 3 year old that was, content to sit in the stroller at Target and get a little treat, right? And so we would have to be a little bit more intentional. And a lot of times it was like we did date nights, intentional date nights, like your dad took each of you to go on a date and I took each of you to go on a date. And we tried to do that monthly with each child. As things got busier and kids got involved in activities, we kind of had to spread that out a little bit. And so maybe it was once a quarter with each of us, whatever that looked like. But we even do that now that you guys have grown, like you guys live close. And so even though we are all living within the same proximity, sometimes weeks go by like where we don't see your sister because we're just all busy. And so like Friday night, she and I went out, we had dinner, we had a ton of laughs. Like it was a lot of fun. But it's, you have to be intentional about it. You have to be willing to send the text or pick up the phone and say, hey, when are we scheduling our date this month? I do that at the beginning of every month. I'm like, okay, let's schedule podcast recordings. Let's schedule our date time. And it looks different when you move away, because then it's like we get maybe 5 days at a time where we're doing every meal together and we're doing things like that. So the memories shift. But I really felt it was important that we each had a separate relationship rather than the kids being treated as the kids as a unit, because you are each individual and you do each enjoy different things. And I wanted you to all know that each of you are my favorite, right? And so we have these little capsules of memories that, like, you may have heard the stories by now of things that Kinsey and I did when she was little, or Sawyer and I did, but they didn't involve you. You weren't part of that, but yet you have your own set of unique stories and memories. So that's why it was important to me, because I wanted each of you to know how much I loved and enjoyed each of you separately and individually. And I knew it was important for you to have that dedicated time with parents. I think a lot of times when you hear about birth order with people and you hear about kind of the bad side of birth order, like how does an oldest typically react? How does a middle typically react? How does a youngest typically react? Sometimes is because when it is on the ugly side of that, it's because they were all treated as a group. And so they only experienced everything from their frame of reference from the birth order, because there were no individual connection points for that child and their parents. So that's why it was really important to me. So
And I think that's important too, one, to have that one-on-one relationship with you as a parent. But two, I think especially in the case of us having three siblings, if you would take Kinsey to go do something, then that just left me and Sawyer to,
yes.
kind of build our relationship, or vice versa. If you just took Sawyer, me and Kinsey built our relationship, whatever it may be. And I think that played a part too in us siblings having a joint relationship with the three of us, but also all three of us having separate
Yeah.
relationships. And I think that that's something that I've noticed, especially as we've gotten older, that we do, like, we have a sibling group chat. We're constantly sending stuff in there and talking and stuff like that, and we'll FaceTime as a group and things like that. But there's also a lot of memories that Kinsey and I have. That's just me and Kinsey, or just me and Sawyer have memories, or just Sawyer and Kinsey have memories, whatever it may be. So I think, you kind of fostering that individual relationship with the kids also then made us foster individual relationships with the other siblings.
Yeah, I love that point, because that was like an unintentional side effect, right, of
Mhm.
what we're doing. And at different stages in your lives, you were closer to a different sibling,
Uh-huh.
based on what was going on and what y'all were interested in. And if we only would have gone to do things that we were all interested in, right? Like there's always somebody who's not getting met where they're at. And so
Uh-huh.
that's why that was really important for me. So having a unique set of memories that were created with each of you is something that I hold really close to my heart. But how did having your one-on-one time with me make you feel as a child? And how does it make you feel now?
For sure. I think, kind of like I touched on a little bit earlier, it just made me feel like we had that individual connection. Like I wasn't, the siblings wasn't a group. And I think a lot of parents and a lot of families have that dynamic where it's kind of like the parents and the kids, and that's it. But I think it was very, very beneficial to us having as close of a relationship as we do now, and just understanding how to navigate that relationship, and understanding that, the same way you and I have an individual relationship, you and Kinsey have an individual relationship, and you and Sawyer have an individual relationship. And it's interesting because now to this day, or in the past when I was a child, I never felt like, oh, mom's favoring Kinsey or favoring Sawyer, or she's spending more time or whatever. Even in the moments where you would just take Kinsey to go do something, it never felt like, one of us was getting special treatment. And I think it's because you would take Kinsey to go do your Saturday errands, but then the next weekend you would take me, and then the next weekend you would take Sawyer. And it was kind of, it might not have necessarily been even, but you made sure to, kind of include everybody and build an individual relationship with everyone. So I never felt like it was, anyone was being excluded, or like there was any tension in that aspect. But I think building that individual relationship is very important. And I think especially as kids get older, it's easier to navigate that relationship. When we're talking about parents with their bigs, if you have, looked at just an example with us, if you've looked at your three kids as one group, then once they get older and, they maybe choose different careers or they move to different states or they, just are, they're all living their different lives, it's almost can be hard to connect to them because you've only viewed them as one. So when you have one that is, being a doctor, and then one that's working a 9 to 5 office job, and then one that is a freelancer living in Colombia, or so, something crazy like that, it's kind of hard to connect with all of them because they're all doing different things, but you have only ever viewed them as one group. So I think building that individual relationship when they're young is very important to your relationship with them as they turn to a big.
Well, and as a parent, like now, I really only get to experience you guys all together, all three of you, once or twice a year. Like that's really all it can happen, just due to proximity and location. That's about to get even more difficult, right? With you moving far away, and so I really enjoy the time that I get to spend with each of you individually, whether that's, date night here in town, or whether that's going to visit your brother, out in Washington, or now visiting, you when you're away. That's just like a next level memory making with you as an adult child. Like I remember experiencing my grandparents as an adult, right? And it feels different. Like, and I was able to spend time with my grandparents alone, also to spend time with my grandparents with my sisters. And that's just an example of the fact that I have those memories. But when I became an adult, those things, the memories that I had felt different, but creating new memories as an adult was equally important to me. And I valued that because I had done it when I was little. So that's what kept that chain going.
For sure. So, we've kind of mentioned the big memories and things like that, but I also touched on earlier the little memories and maybe the things that you didn't even think would be memories. At the time, I think, you and us probably didn't even realize that they would be so important and they would be such big memories for us. But how do you think those little things kind of became etched in our minds, and those little things are what ended up being important? I think sometimes when people hear creating memories, they think it needs to be, oh, we're creating memories of going on some extravagant family vacation, or we're creating memories of, a lot of the times it needs to be expensive, or they think it needs to be a big event, or it needs to, be a whole thing. But sometimes the little memories are just as important. So why do you think that is?
Sometimes it's by accident that things become a memory, right? Like you said, you didn't intend when you set out to have a memory about that. But sometimes it's also repetition. Like if you find something, you're doing something as a family, like let's say this is the idea that popped into my head, but like I remember at our house when we lived in Minnesota doing sprinkler day with you guys, and it would be hot in the summer, and we had this great fabulous deck, and we would literally turn on the sprinkler. You guys were in your swimsuits, you had sunscreen on until you like wouldn't let me put any more sunscreen on, and you guys would just run through the sprinkler off and on all day. You'd eat lunch outside on the deck. And like I look back at those memories and I'm like, that was something, it wasn't intentional the first time I did it, right? The first time when I was like, oh, this is going to be outside day and we're just going to hang out in our swimsuits, all day and eat outside. And the dogs were running around and, it was just a lot of fun. But I think back to that time and I think of how many times we repeated that. And even when we moved to Kansas, then repeated it here. And so like I can picture all three of your little brown bodies, right? Like just slicked with wet and your hair slicked back and eating your peanut butter and jelly sandwich at the table and, laying stretched out on your beach towels. And
Mhm.
I didn't intend for that to be a memory, but it truly is a memory for me. And so that's just one example. Back on our episodes when we talked about traditions, things like decorating Christmas cookies and that kind of stuff, we didn't necessarily intend the first year we did it. We didn't say, oh, this is definitely going to be a tradition, but it was just repeating it over time, I think was how it became a core memory. And sometimes those little things are just things that are hysterically funny in the moment when they happen, and that's what sears them in your memory. People also have sad memories. We're choosing not to talk about this at this time because there's enough crazy stuff going on in the world that's already making us sad, so we're not going to talk about that. We're just talking about the happy memories right now. But it's those funny moments where you just like laughed until your sides were splitting, or you think back on it now and you're like, oh my gosh, we were so crazy, like I can't believe we did that. But so the little things a lot of times truly are just those little nuggets that become like these big family stories and laugh out loud moments that have you, like when your sister and I were out on Friday night and we were talking about some of these things, she literally was like almost slithered onto the floor of the passenger side of my car because she was laughing so hard. And,
Uh-huh.
so it's like those little things that you did way back 20 years ago, like can make you laugh so hard that you just are back in that moment immediately. So I think that's why the little things to me are almost more important than the big things, because they were simple and they didn't cost extra money. And so I think there is a very low barrier to entry. I think a lot of times parents that don't create memories think it has to be, like you said, something big, when in reality, the ones that really hit home are the ones that happened repeatedly over time and were
Uh-huh.
really not that big of a deal in the moment, but now they're the ones that make you smile the biggest.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like you said, I think when you kind of take that pressure off of, oh, I'm trying to create a memory or I'm doing this so that way they have a memory. I think when you take that pressure off and kind of get out of that mindset and maybe just focus more on having a good time and, letting your kids have fun, that is just kind of what leads to those natural, smaller memories.
Yeah. And having fun with them, I think is important
Mhm.
too, to take that time. And like I said, there were times when I was so in the execution of creating the memory that I wasn't present in that moment. So that's one thing I learned as a young parent. And I try now to be more present in the moment. Like when we're all sitting around the table playing cards or whatever, I'm not worried about the fact that the appetizers have been sitting out for 3 hours and somebody's going to get sick from eating them. Like I am present in the moment, laughing hysterically at this new crazy mega Uno game, whatever
Uh-huh.
that might be. So, a life full of small moments, right, knit together over time can really make for a rich family history. But then you add to that a few bigger items like events, adventures, or vacations, and all of a sudden you've got plenty of conversation starters for when you're together with your family. So, if you're the parent of a big and you'd like to continue or start, it's never too late, right? Adding to your shared memory bank, please do so, because you will. This is something you will not regret. I think you've been able to see the joy on our faces or hear the joy in our voices if you're listening and not watching on YouTube. I'm never too late to start creating that. So if a parent were wanting to make new memories with their bigs, I'm going to start the sentence over. So if a parent were to want to make new memories with their big, Kate, how would you suggest they go about doing that or approaching that?
For sure. I think it's important just to kind of start. I think sometimes we think, oh, it's too late to make these memories, or I didn't do it while they were a kid, or I didn't start it while they were a kid. And I think that's okay. It doesn't need to be memories starting from childhood. I think a lot of times when we think of creating memories, those are the memories we think of. Oh, when I was 3, we did this, or when I was 10, we did this. But there's a lot of, conversations we have where we talk about things that happened 6 months ago that we think are funny. So it's never too late to build those memories. And I think that's important. And I think building those memories, whether they be little kids or bigs or whatever, is very important to your relationship and your family dynamic. And like I said, it's never too late. And it can start with something small, kind of like we talked about earlier. It doesn't need to be a big, expensive vacation to start, to make those memories, or it doesn't need to be, some necessarily even intentional big memories. A lot of the times it can start off by just saying, okay, let's all get together for dinner, on Saturday. And then something will be said at that dinner table that'll be funny that will lead to, those memories. So I think just being open to making the memories and not even necessarily trying for it to be a big thing, but just, starting to build those connections, build those memories. And I think they'll just kind of naturally happen. But what about for you, Mom? What do you think as a parent trying to make memories with your young adults? How would you navigate that?
Yeah, so I think that it can happen on either side. Parents can reach out, young adults can reach out. I think it's for a parent asking the young adult what they might like to do. So, like you said, if you live in proximity, family dinners are a great idea. If you just now have kiddos leaving for college, like one of the things that I made a tradition was I always made sure to acknowledge midterms and finals. And usually that looked like a virtual gift card, right? To go buy themselves a coffee or to go get a Sonic treat or do something like that. But it was just acknowledging that I knew what they were dealing with right then and that I was thinking of them. So it can be something that tiny that you do, and then that always involved a conversation, right? It opened the door to a how are finals going, how are midterms going, are you feeling stressed, is there anything I can do to help, are you getting enough sunshine, are you taking your vitamin D, right? All those parent things that happen, but then just also your child knowing that they can depend on you. So that as a parent, it can be that tiny. As a young adult, if you're wishing that you had more memories like that with your parent, As I'm seeing my parents now approaching the age of 80, there's never enough memories when your parent gets to that age, right? Like you think back and you're like, oh, I want to continue making those memories because you start to realize that you may not have much time. And the truth is, we never know how much time we have. And so I would encourage young adults, if they're wishing to have those types of memories with their parents, with their siblings and their parents as a whole, with their siblings, just in general, to just reach out. And you don't have to say, like, you can, if you want to say, hey, I'm wishing that we had a bigger memory bank of really great times together. And so can we start creating those? Here's what I'm thinking. Or you can just say, hey, would you like to start having coffee with me every Friday? Or would you like to start, having our family get together the last Thursday of every month, or whatever that looks like for you? It can be something big. Hey, do you guys all want to go on a cruise? All of my children are going to Hawaii in a few months together. And it's like, I can't imagine the memories they're going to make. And I can't wait to hear when they come back. So it's never too late to reach out and try to establish those. So as a young adult, if you have a parent who hasn't done that, and this is not to make anybody feel bad for a lack of family memories, because we all know that many of us were on the struggle bus as young parents and just trying to be able to get through and keep everybody fed and alive and keep our sanity. And so this maybe wasn't on the radar screen, but as you gain some bandwidth, hopefully as you get older and your kids are off living their lives and being a little more independent, you can put a little more time and energy into that. But it can come from the bigs too. The bigs can initiate that if you have a parent who's not likely to do so.
For
So
sure.
I think, our listeners know by now that I am a sucker for a sappy emotional memory. As a parent, I imagine that as I age, when I'm approaching my 80s, those memories are going to bring me so many smiles and probably a few laugh out loud moments while I sit in my Adirondack chair overlooking the ocean, right? Big dreams, people, big dreams, but that's a conversation for another day. Anything else you'd like to add before you close us out, Cade, about creating memories?
For sure. I think it's just important to remember that you can create memories at any point in time. And especially, when we're talking about parent and big relationships, bigs, don't be afraid to make the effort to start those memories. They're just as important to you as they are your parents. So I think that's important to remember. But I think with that being said, that is a wrap for this episode of Raising Bigs. We thank you all for listening today. We hope you found some takeaways, a fresh perspective, and maybe even an action step or two in this episode. Again, we are not experts, but we can authentically share what we're learning in hopes of making the path a little more joy-filled for those who are listening. You can find this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. Please subscribe and share with those in your circle who you think might benefit from hearing it. A new episode is released on those three platforms every single week.
You can visit my life coach website at marcihawkinson.com or email me at lifecoachmarci.com. You can also find me on Facebook at Life Coach Marci and Instagram at life_coach_Marci. Where can our listeners find you, Cade?
My handle across all social media platforms is at the Cade Berrigan. That's where you can find me. The best way to contact us give us feedback is to DM either one of us on social media, or again, reach out on the contact me page on my mom's website, marcihawkinson.com. We appreciate any feedback, topic ideas, or questions that you may like to share, and we will see you next time on Raising Bigs.
Bye, everybody.